Yeah, Angelo, thank you for letting me do this presentation, this workshop with you today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, what I'll do is go over some like of the main objectives of what we'll be going over today, and kind of give a run through of what those are before we kind of jump into the main content of the material that I've prepared for all of you today. And to kind of just give a summary of the objectives of what we're going to be going into, I will kind of just give you a run through of what these are. So first off is Christ's life as the hero's journey. So what we're going to be looking into is the story of Jesus Christ and how it mirrors many of Carl Jung's ideas, one being the process of individuation and the archetype of the self in Jungian psychology. And we're going to look at how this illustrates the journey of self-discovery and, of course, the integration of the shadow in many other ways also. But apart from that, we're also going to look at how we can confront and integrate with the shadow that Carl Jung talks about a lot in his own work. So with this, we'll be exploring the necessity of acknowledging and embracing the rejected aspects of ourselves. How can we confront these things about ourselves so that we can reach towards a sense of wholeness? And we're going to also look at, again, Christ's teachings within the Gospels of where we can find these teachings in his own work and in his own messages. One example we could be using would be like the parable of the casting of the first stone within the Gospels, and how that can also act as a guiding principle for psychological wholeness with regards to the shadow. And lastly, we're also going to be looking into spiritual and psychological transformations. So how can we engage with Christ's teachings and symbolism through a psychological lens, through depth psychology, and how can we, by doing that, grasp a greater sense of self-awareness, inner healing, and a stronger sense of spiritual fulfillment. So with that kind of overview gone through, what I think is always beneficial to start off with is by asking a question when talking about intellectual concepts and spiritual endeavors. And that question is something I've been pondering on quite a bit as well with regards to the symbolism of Christ and the meaning of Christ with regards to psychology and Jungian psychology in particular. But also you could see it as quite controversial, but also quite inquisitive with regards to what is the nature of Christ in terms of his meaning. And this question is, have you ever wondered why Christ's life and teachings resonate so deeply across most major cultures around the world? Why is Christ's recognition found in most major religions, but this not to be the case for other major religious figures in history? Now, this was something that I noticed quite significantly when looking into Christianity and the figure of Christ, was that Christ is recognized in many areas across the world from different cultural traditions. I mean, we see Islam, where Christ is recognized as a prophet. We see Christ recognized as a significant religious figure from other Eastern traditions in Buddhism or Hinduism. And of course, he's also recognized in Judaism, but not as a significant, prophetic figure within Judaism. But what we see here is that there is this significant recognition across many, many different cultural traditions around the world. But we don't see this, interestingly enough, the other way around. We don't see this with Buddhism with regards to Christianity, or like prophetic figures within other religions being recognized in other religions across the world. And I was wondering this for quite a while, and it was kind of the initial question that kind of helped me look into how to make this workshop with regards to Christ, Jungian psychology, and the concept of the shadow. Because there is one individual who does give us a good answer to why this is the case. Carl Jung specifically, who gives us an answer to this question. And his answer is that Jesus Christ is resemblant of the archetype of the self. of what he calls the archetype of the self. And in Jungian psychology, Carl Jung was a psychologist within the foundations of um, psychoanalysis. And what Jung developed as an archetype within his understanding of psychology and the human mind was this idea of the self. And he believed that it was our innate desire to guide ourselves towards what we could say God or the divine, or our desire to reach some sense of wholeness. So the archetype of the self represents the totality of the psyche and our inherent drive towards wholeness, or what we could also call God in some cases. So as an archetype, it encompasses not only the conscious mind or the ego, but also the integration of the unconscious, both personal and collective, with regards to our psyche and humanity. So the self acts as what we could say an organizing center of the psyche, working to unify all aspects of the individual and create harmony between opposites. But the self as an archetype has a goal. And that goal, that ultimate drive, is a drive towards wholeness, or what you could say towards individuation, as Jung would have coined it, or self-actualization, which is the process of becoming your true and complete self. So the way in which this relates to Christ, when Jung is applying an analysis to what Christ means psychologically, is that Christ is this individual who is reaching towards individuation, or he embodies this example of a process of becoming the self as an archetype. He specifically says here that, quote, the process of individuation is the development of the total personality of the self, which brings us into contact with the archetypal images of the unconscious. And he specifically says here, which is really interesting, we don't see this much in Jung's work, but he says, Christ is the supreme example of this process of becoming the self, symbolizing a complete integration of the conscious and unconscious elements. So he's saying Christ represents a supreme example of this, a supreme example of achieving or trying to be in alignment with, we could say, God's will to achieve some sense of divinity or wholeness, which is very interesting because we don't usually see this, we could say, extreme opinionated belief by Carl Jung's work when he's looking at religious figures. It's not very common. But a student of Carl Jung took this a step further, and he says that Edward Edinger is his name, said that Christ represents what he called the self-orientated ego, or the individuated ego, the man who is achieving himself or aligning himself towards God, and therefore representing individuation himself. And the reason why he says this is because there is a particular verse in the Gospels where Christ says, I do nothing of myself, but as my Father have taught me. So what Christ is saying here is that he does nothing of his own will. He does nothing of his own, you could say, instinct, intention, that which is not in association with God. He only does what is in association with God's will. He's only following God's will. So we have this very interesting concept here where we're seeing that Christ is resemblant of someone who aligns himself with God's will consistently, and that itself represents this process of individuation, becoming, the integration of opposites, becoming self-actualized, and achieving fulfillment in this kind of sense. So Jung saw Jesus as being this supreme example of this archetype, whereby Christ's life embodies wholeness with his alignment towards God's will. We see in the Gospels as well that he regards himself as the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, that he is on this process of individuation. And we can see this with an example with Christ, where he's overcoming the temptation in the wilderness, for example. He's trying to overcome these challenges, these temptations, these difficulties, so that he can reach closer towards God. And then, of course, the integration of opposites also being represented in the figure of Christ, where he overcomes death in the story in the Gospels, where he he's living, he dies, but then he resurrects again. So that Christ represents this very interesting, complex figure of what we could say is this archetype of the self. So some Eastern examples of this archetype that are not specifically more westernized like Christ would be the mandala, as you can see on the image here, which is more of an Eastern representation, an artistic representation. Or we have in Taoism the symbolism of the yin and the yang, which is the integration of opposites into one holistic form. So these are the type of symbols that we can find that represent this archetype. But it's all interesting to kind of, discover this and kind of understand this symbolic meaning. But how do we achieve individuation ourselves? How do we get on this journey of aligning ourselves towards something that could be representative of a more divine will that can lead us towards some form of self-actualization or individuation? So Carl Jung answers our first question, which is, why is Jesus recognized cross-culturally in all of these places? He represents this archetype of the self, something of wholeness in many different ways. So who can answer our question when it comes to how do we achieve individuation? How do I achieve individuation? And we can go to Joseph Campbell, who is very much also a student of Jung, to answer this question for us, because what he recognized was that there is a pattern or a process of transformation that is consistent within most stories and mythologies of heroes and very great figures of history. And what he recognized was what he called the monomyth, or what you could call the one myth that represents all myths fundamentally, which is represents a process of transformation for the individual when they go upon it. And what I realized when making this comparison with the hero's journey and the figure of Christ is that to become individuated, or to reach individuation in some sort of sense, to become self-actualized, we need to actually go on our own hero's journey to embark on our own monomyth. And this is, when I compared this to Christ's life, we find a perfect mirroring of the stages of Christ's life with the stages of the hero's journey. So, for example, I'll run through some of those stages for you just for the sake of example. One within the hero's journey, one very strong stage is called the call to adventure, which is being taken out of the known world into a situation or a calling which is more unknown to us or unconscious to us, so that we achieve greater self-realization. And we have this significant stage within Christ's life through his baptism, which is the beginning of his ministry. We have John the Baptist, he baptizes Christ, he takes on the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit of God, and that is the beginning of his ministry. It's a transformation stage or initiation stage, we could say. We, of course, have his descent into the unknown in terms of the hero's journey, which could be, after he's baptized, he goes on his ministry, which is one part of that is very significant within the temptation in the wilderness. Christ is tested of his commitment to God by Satan. And Satan is testing his commitment to see if he is actually the true prophecy and the true prophetic Messiah of the second coming and all of this type of thing. And then after that, we have the ordeal, which is what Christ is most recognized for, which is the crucifixion. And where he embodies symbolically the Lamb of God and goes through the sacrifice of atonement. And what we can see is that there are a consistent comparative relationship with the hero's journey and this process in which Christ is going on. And of course, we have the return, just as in the hero's journey, from the unknown world to the known world, where Christ has fulfilled his mission, we could say. He's reborn and he ascends to heaven, and he brings forth the Great Commission, which is the teachings of what God has given him. And the message that we should continue on his teachings, basically, and then he ascends back to heaven. So there's this continuous cyclical process in also Christ's own life. So when it comes to ourselves, we have to ask the question, how do we relate to the hero's journey ourselves? Because the hero's journey, we could say, is a blueprint. It's a fundamental first principle for transformation. If we want to transform, we want to know ourselves better, we want to, overcome stresses, insecurities, fears. It's all in relation to the hero's journey. Am I ignoring maybe a certain call to adventure in which I need to partake on for myself to overcome certain stresses in my life? Maybe there are certain challenges and temptations that I need to confront going through the hero's journey, and kind of reflecting on this with regards to ourselves. But this doesn't really get into the fundamental stuff with regards to the shadow. So where else in the Bible can we find this idea of the shadow consistent within the Bible itself? And I think there are a lot of verses in the Bible and within Jesus's teachings that reflect this idea. So what is quite consistent is this idea of shadow projection. So the shadow is within Jungian psychology, represents basically these disavowed parts of ourselves in which we repress, we reject, and that we avoid, basically, or that we hide away from ourselves. And when it comes to the teaching of Christ, with one of his verses where he says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her," this relates specifically to the idea of shadow projection and scapegoating, which are two psychological phenomena that happen when we're not being, let's say, truly honest or vulnerable with ourselves when it comes to blame, judgment, and things like this. So what happens in this story is Jesus comes across this crowd of Pharisees who are trying to basically bring about Mosaic law, which is that you have to stone a woman if she commits adultery, in this whole kind of narrative. And Jesus comes along and he basically, says this verse, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And I see this symbolically as representing Christ coming in to be a mirror to these people, a mirror of self-reflection, or more specifically, a mirror of self-reflection for their own shadow, so that they don't externalize their shadow, but instead internalize it. Because what is actually happening here? We have a lot of judgment, we have a lot of condemnation, hatred towards this woman who is deserving of forgiveness. Why is there this kind of, this death penalty being casted upon her? And these people believing that they are righteous enough to judge her when they themselves are not God either. They're not God, so they can't judge her, but they feel like they have this righteousness to do so. So this desire from this crowd could kind of represent this projection of their shadow, where they're evading the responsibility of integrating with their own vices, maybe themselves, maybe their own fears, their own insecurities, their own shadow. Because there's a good chance that maybe within this crowd, a lot of the people here are themselves adulterers. Maybe they are very sinful people as well, and they want to find a victim, they want to find a scapegoat to cast their blame onto and to cast their judgment onto in a very vicious way to such an extreme. And so what Christ offers here through this question is an opportunity for self-reflection, but also individuation. He's saying, look, if you acknowledge your own shadow, the crowd could then integrate it rather than externalize it. Because the question he is asking is, are you someone who has not committed sin? Are you trying to compare yourself to God, someone who believes that you have all the righteousness in the world to, deem this woman evil or something like this? So what ends up happening is that no one does cast a stone at her. So what Christ is bringing forth is this ability to reflect upon their own shadow, reflect upon the wrongdoing that they are committing themselves. So when we apply this to more of a modern context, we can ask ourselves, what if most judgment we cast onto others, how much of our own judgment is a reflection of the parts of ourselves we are unwilling to face? We have, modern cultural examples, maybe with like political division, we have cancel culture, or maybe even more personal examples could be like familial conflicts within our own families. With, let's say, for example, you had a brother or a sister, and then that sister or that brother, you have a lot of animosity towards them or resentment towards them. Maybe when they specifically do something in which you are not very much someone who's capable of doing a certain thing. Maybe that person's doing something good for someone, and maybe you start to think, or maybe they're trying to just get, be seen as a good person rather than doing it out of the kindness of their own heart. Maybe, there's this relationship between how we see others and the relationship we have with their actions with regards to ourselves. So looking into political division, the whole kind of narrative of blame and scapegoating that happens there, or even within cancel culture, are some good modern examples of how we can look at this happening today. Because especially with cancel culture, it's constantly a game of blame, judgment, and fundamentally cancelling out of other people because certain opinions may just not merge with our own and all of this type of thing. When at the same time, we can learn something from every single person, no matter what their opinion is. So with that one example, that kind of leads us on to a second example, which is also the same with shadow projection, but specifically more through the lens of judgment. So how does that relate to the concept of the shadow as well? So on the Sermon on the Mount, I think, within the book of Matthew, Christ specifically says, first take the beam out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So what is this specifically telling us here as well? Well, first, we have to look at the word beam. Beam is something much larger than a speck. So like Christ is basically saying that we need to take much more responsibility for our own faults and for our own misconducts and wrongdoings before we can, try and help other people, which as a first principle in terms of like ethics, even from a Christian standpoint, is very, admirable. It's very much a righteous thing to be doing, right? But what we see here is that isn't what is happening. Like if we see in this depiction of the situation that is being portrayed from the story of the parable of the man judging the man judging the individual who has the speck in his eye but not recognizing the beam in his own, is that he's disregarding his own faults, his own sins, his own unintegrated aspects of himself, and hiding them away from his own self-acknowledgement, because it's easier for him to take care of try and take care of the minor flaws that we can quickly point out in others. This is more easier to do. It requires less accountability. It requires less responsibility for ourselves. So this intention of doing that, the desire to like try and help others or try and like, point out the flaws in other people, is actually due to being unconsciously unaware or refusing to face the problems we have within ourselves. We're more likely or more desiring to want to ignore those things. So we, choose to pick out on things of other flaws of other people more quickly and more consistently. So Christ is calling us to, again, reflect on our shadow, stop projecting the shadow onto other people, and take accountability and responsibility for these things and these faults that we are more willingly to project onto others. And this is another example of where this concept of shadow projection through judgment is occurring. And of course, the realigning towards not doing that, but taking responsibility instead. So with regards to the shadow, those are two major concepts we can see within the Gospels. Another concept, if we go back to the archetype of the self, and the integration of opposites and becoming whole, is we find another verse in Christ's teachings. I find very profound. I really enjoy this verse because it has so many layered meanings within it, which is where Christ says to his people as an ethical principle, be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So what is interesting here, when we look at the archetype of the self and this concept of wholeness and integration, is that Christ is identifying virtues within two things that have opposing natures. So the serpent and the dove, they are two animals which have, you could say, opposing natures. One's a predator, one is prey. They have different drives in a sense. But he's identifying the virtues that are within these two, metaphorical descriptions of these animals, the qualities and characteristics that they have, in which are virtuous, in which we need to integrate to become more aligned towards wholeness and God fundamentally, which is that the serpent represents wisdom, we could say, because it exercises discernment. It knows the lay of the land, which is fundamentally to avoid being gullible, naive, and reckless. To have discernment would be to not have these other qualities of being gullible and naive. And this is very much what the serpent represents. It knows what it's doing. It's aware of its surroundings. It's wise in that sense. So here we see wisdom or discernment spiritually is a form of strategic thinking rooted in a form of spiritual righteousness. But then he goes to the opposing nature, which is the dove, something that's much more innocent, something that is prey in the world of biology. And he's saying, be harmless as doves. And this harmlessness is a representation of innocence. It represents purity of intent, honesty, and humility in action. And this is more of a teaching towards, or a leaning towards, you could say, Christ's nature, where Christ is more non-violent. He has a gentle nature to himself, and he avoids retaliation. So what we see really interestingly here is when it comes to becoming whole, becoming individuated, is that Christ is specifically merging these two, finding the virtues within two opposing natures. It's very much similar to the symbol of the yin and the yang, where we merge, which represents duality coming into one whole or into one form. And again, symbolically, this is exactly what's happening here also in this verse within Christ's teachings, where complementary virtues are coming together, and that as a teaching acts as an ethical principle for the people in which he is preaching towards, that this is what we should be driving ourselves towards, that we should be becoming wise yet harmless, we should be shrewd yet honest, clever but sincere, cautious yet open-hearted, steadfast yet adaptable, these types of things where we're rational but faithful. We have this good balance of opposites when trying to develop our relationship towards God or becoming more self-actualized as an individual. So that kind of leads us basically at the end of the content and more towards the experiential questions and exercises. So there's two questions that we're going to go over. One's going to be on the self, where we're going to look at more of how we can relate to the hero's journey, and one's more on the shadow with regards to, how do we find, how can we write down a flaw that we often notice in others that irritates us, and what does that say about ourselves? So we'll be going into that also in separate groups.
Go over the stages of the hero's journey for us, and maybe give us maybe one question at a time that we can all kind of respond to.
Yeah, so I say like a call to adventure. So is there any part in your life right now where you feel like there is a call to something different that takes you out of your usual routine, that takes you out of maybe confronting an anxiety or something that stresses you out, but you believe and you know that it will make you into a stronger individual? So this type of thing.
Yeah, and I can answer the question that Spencer just raised for me. So you talk about the call to adventure and what do you see the next step is and maybe what's keeping you there or something like that.
Yeah.
So I've been sort of like the sort of like the leader, I guess you could call it, of this community. And one of the things that holds, so the whole idea is to create community. So that's kind of the next step. Why don't I do it? And it's because of the shadow, because I don't want to use the word shy, but I'm not, there's a part of me which is not like in comfort about being a sort of like public person, leader thing. So that's what comes up when you raise that question for me.
Hmm. So is that like something that you are more anxious or fearful towards, of like trying to embody that part of yourself, or?
I don't think it's not, well, maybe it's partly a fear, but it's like unconscious, Spencer. It's not something I'm sort of in touch with. I know that um I periodically have bouts of I'll call it depression, or another word would be I don't feel like sharing. I don't really feel like being public.
Right.
So in those moments, I don't. And the sort of like the effect of that, as far as the community goes, is that it's not there. If that makes sense.
So like sharing your own experiences and
Just
your
just
own.
just being public, being out there. I'd rather just my tendency when I would sort of go into my dark night of the soul, I guess you want to call it, is just to be by myself. I don't really want to share. I don't want to be in a group. you know.
Right.
So that's this is like I've been like this is not new. This is like part of a recurring pattern for me.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because the way that I relate to wanting to be part of a group or trying to publicly speak about something would never be really particularly about um the thing that would get me maybe through the front door of that is to look at things intellectually and to find like a shared message that can be talked about with other people, like for example this workshop. So it's like, with regards to there being like for me maybe an anxiety towards public speaking or maybe talking about these types of things, the intellectual side of that would help a lot because I'd be able to kind of share what I think or share these ideas that can be understood by other people, so that there can be like a relationship between all these things.
Makes sense.
One thing that comes up for me there is, I really resonate with that in a lot of ways, Angelo, where at least the way I interpret it is um oftentimes maybe I feel more comfortable processing or I feel more efficient processing things individually, as opposed to in a public setting or like amongst a group. And that's like where I often revert back to is, if I want to process something, I want to go and be, in solitude and kind of figure that out. And then in that instance, I'm not looking to be in group either, or looking to kind of, maybe I don't feel comfortable sharing that whole self in public in that way, and I'm much more comfortable kind of revealing that to myself, like in between me and the different versions of myself, taking a look at that. But I think the irony is that I tell myself everyone else in the group might feel that as well, and so I think there's something
Um,
interesting about how the idea of wanting to isolate is something that people can relate to in group. And I don't know, that's just what comes up for me there, because I feel like I resonate with that.
yeah, it's interesting. As some of you know, I spent some time in China, and it's like there's so many people.
Mm,
So what that means, like in a practical level, is that you'll see people, they'll just like talking on their cell phones in public, which is an annoying thing. Talking about annoying things that but it's like they don't have this sort of like sense of, me and the group. They know that they're part of a group, and that's what they do. You hear me? So maybe this kind of thing that we're talking about, Gabe, is like a particularly kind of Western thing where we have this sort of privacy. Everybody's so obsessed about their damn privacy, whereas if a culture doesn't have privacy, it's not a shadow thing for them.
This is like, yeah, it's really reminding me. I have a very similar thing, except with my own views and thoughts. And like, say, my writing is a big one. I just constantly undercut myself, say. This idea of like sort of judgment or being judged or something like that, I think is probably the unconscious part of it. But yeah, you just reminded me when you said about Western culture and being private. I don't know. I'm just rambling here, but something I've been thinking about a lot is that basically any time that we're out of relationship or we're not in relationship with other people and talking, I've learned to see that as an issue. And nearly every time I'm struggling with my whatever mental health, whatever you call it, I've began to not focus on that terminology as much as someone who's going into psychology, even. But I think it's like we're fundamentally made for a relationship, and this Western focus on individualism is actually not good. And yeah, there's lots of thoughts about how that came into our mind. And one thought is Max Weber and through the linking of the Protestant sort of mentality and the American dream, and that leads to an individualist outlook, and then you can see that through this fracturing of the Protestant church, going their own ways 1,000 different times. So it's very interesting. I don't know. I just lots of different thoughts.
Yeah, that is interesting because like I'm now go ahead there, Laurie. That's you talking.
Yeah, I would just like to respond to that. The individualization and individuation, and we're talking about discovering the sense of us. And yes, being in connection with others is a way of discovering that and finding that. But I really think that we actually need our own time and our solitude to really, really grasp that self. Because when we're in connection with other people and there's other things and we're considering other people and other things that are going on, to actually find that true self, you must do this. This is my experience. You must do this on your own, in your own time, in your own space. And you could be out in nature doing that or whatever. But for me, it's essential to have that very quiet time. And we're also seeing, it's also criticized that we are alone and we're not in connection with people, and that is seen as negative, and that we're antisocial or whatever. But this private present time is through us and being alone.
I just want to piggyback on that, Laurie. I think you mentioned something really interesting in the idea of, because I do resonate with that, where I do feel most comfortable kind of doing, looking at these parts of myself when it is in solitude. And you mentioned about, maybe doing that stuff in nature. And I think that to me resonates or like speaks to this larger thing that even if I'm not around people, I'm still in a group, right? I'm still kind of not alone. And I think that to me has always been a very tangible element of self, in that I'm not just a human in this like flesh body. There's like more there. And that I think comes through this personal experience in solitude, and almost see myself in group, but not necessarily through the lens of other humans. And so I think I don't know, I think there's something interesting there.
Yeah, there's such a lot there, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but I guess I'm going on it. But the truth of the matter is that we're social beings, and there's this whole thing that we're part of everything anyway. You know what I mean? And there's the part of us that is the individual self, and there's part of us that is part of this whole thing. So there's lots of ways that people deal with that. I'll just say that.
I think that's true. Sorry, I'm just going to add one more thing to that. that
thing.
being in the presence of one's own self is actually the whole process of the one that we're actually discussing today. Because without that, you're not going to get to the places that you need to. Because
Yeah.
there's too many distractions, there's too many pulls away, and you need to develop the strength and the courage, inner strength and courage to do it. Because it's not an easy road.
No. Yeah, you reminded me of there what you said, Ian, of, it's immanence and transcendence. Christ is immanent, God is transcendent. Amy Gilchrist would say the immanence is the local, and the local is the left brain, and the right brain is the transcendent, and the widest possible view on things. Yeah, and then in Hinduism, the personal gods are subsumed within the Brahman, the greater transcendent being. And then pantheism, divine is fully present through all of it. There's lots of different ways of saying this similar thing that we're all saying. It's very interesting.
Yeah, the word that keeps coming to me is just balance. I think, part of the journey is finding that balance between being able to be in a group and, connect and be able to contribute in some sort of healthy way, but then also know when to, I guess, retreat into one's own being and to do the spiritual work that's needed. And like when I think about my life, a lot of the times it's like when it was revealed that like I had to do certain shit or I had to do certain work or improve upon myself, it was almost always like someone else or the group showing me like, here's your weakness, like you're not good at this. But then the work was always just me, like having to sit with like, oh fuck, they're right. I'm not stepping up in this way. How do I go about like raising my consciousness to a point where I can like show up for the group or the family or whatever it may be. And then, but then, it's like this continuous cycle because after like doing the self-reflection, then I would reach out to a coach or a therapist to help me work through, or a close friend to help me work through the shit. So it's like this constant, like kind of like the tides. This constant like feeling of like when like the group is so useful, but this alone reflection is also useful. And through my hero's journey, I feel like understanding when each one is useful. I would say like I used to be a super extrovert and now I'm becoming an introvert to the point where I'm like, oh, like I need to start being a little more extroverted. Like the pendulum is just swinging and I'm trying to find that balance, which is all of this great points and very interesting. I appreciate y'all.
I'm looking at Spencer's list here that Ian shared, and a lot of what we're talking about reflects these stages. So you talk about approach to the inner cave, where the hero nears the greatest challenge, often facing self-doubt, and the ordeal with trying to deal with it. And a lot of that is, I guess, an individual process, at least the inner cave part of it. And the reward is that, you've come out of your, Lori was saying, after going inside, you you emerge victorious or whatever, so that you're able to be more fully, what's the word, present and effective in the world.
Yeah. And what I love about the just the kind of the narrative of the hero's journey when you apply it to your own life is that it is a consistent thing, constantly applying to yourself all the time. Like same to this idea of like if you're on a spiritual journey, you're never done at any point. You're just constantly learning, constantly changing as a person, which is similar to what you're saying, Ian, about like these tides where you're pulled one way or pulled this other way. Maybe you're more extrovert at one point, now you become more introverted, and then you learn from these different sides of your own life. And it's interesting because there's like loads of symbolism for that also in like religious circles. Like if you look at Islam with just the concept of circumambulation, which is this idea of rotating around something consistently to try and reach its center point. Like you have this really interesting kind of like a ritual process within Christianity where Christians would walk around a labyrinth and pray at the same time, and then get to the center and then walk out of it from a different kind of maze point. And it kind of acts as this kind of like this concept of constantly trying to reach closer towards this form of self-developed spiritual self, you could say, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's really sort of like essential that you put it that way for me, because if I'm looking at this list, I can be tempted to think this is like a kind of a linear thing. I start here and I end there. But what you're saying is that it's a sporadic kind of process. So you don't
Yeah,
really get to the end of it. You start another cycle begins, and you go through this process again.
yeah.
If
Like I see that with myself. If like if I've had a certain fear of something or in the past, you go through this kind of journey and then you apply it to some other part of your life, and then you apply it to some like it's like a consistent self-improved process, you could say.
I'm just going to comment on that. I think this might be quite obvious, but for those of us who've been living in Ecuador, we've had a very interesting experience, in particular, how nature shows us this process. And like 8 months ago, we were in the biggest drought in 60 years. And it was like so dry. The plants, the trees, everything was suffering. And, I was questioning as to whether it was even going to survive. And then we ran into power outages because there wasn't enough water. And so it was like the energy was being pulled out, if I can use that analogy. In the meantime, the drought continued. And then because of the drought, the fires started. And we know what the destruction that fire plays. And it was really bad this year, like really bad. And there was kind of like 3 sections of these intense fires that would come and just took everything. And in the process, it took water pipes, and so that then people were out of water as well, not because of the drought, but because of the systems. So if I think of a psychological or emotional process in that same way, is that there's a spring, we feel really great, and then all of a sudden the drought comes, and the deep feelings emotionally come, and in that there is a destruction that happens, and there's a burning up, which is what we experienced here with the fires. That there was a burning up, and it took everything, and the burning up removed what was no longer needed anymore. And so when we go through the process of self-actualization, we're actually discovering new things about us, and then we no longer need those things that we just don't need anymore, like maybe a little bit of self-doubt or a little bit of fear. We have more confidence, so we can step into more things. And after the fire, so very quickly, it is so lush because the rain started. It is so lush, and things are growing in a way that we would never ever imagine. And so that's creating new life. So the process of breaking down destruction and becoming anew. So for me, just looking at nature and what it's always directing me and showing me, even about my own process, because as the fires were happening here, I was experiencing some very deep, dark nights, going through the process of like what needs to be let go of here because it's no longer useful. And I felt like I wanted to be pulled in a new direction, which I have and continue to be. But we can't miss this. We cannot be in this process because we are equal to nature, and we respond and work in the same way that nature does. So the sun comes out, the rains come, we get new life, and we have new expectations and new experiences, and go from there. So this, to me, is really a lot about what we're talking about today in this road to discovering more of who we are. So yeah, just leave it at that.
As above, so below.
I'm sort of reflecting on the what we've been talking about, and I'll call it the political situation. not just the political situation, but the political situation, the environmental situation, and all that. So I'll just ask Spencer, since he knows about these things. How can we make a connection between kind of the individual collective journey that we're on right now in this critical stage of humanity right now? I know that's a big question, Spencer, but you can handle it.
Oh God, I don't know. Reading in between the lines, I guess. Like when I'm talking about like for example, we have like scapegoating, blame, and judgment to the point where it's so extreme, and you're assuming all sorts of things about like people when you don't really know, or stuff like this. If you apply it specifically to like politics or like cancel culture, just as for example, you know, being way more self-reflective about where you stand as a person and how you think about things is way more a necessity than kind of merging with any kind of group ideology or anything like this, you know. Or if someone's, let's say, that like politically they identify as like conservative and they have all of these opinions, and then, you know, how much, you know, we need to like ask ourselves, you know, why would we identify with a particular group? Why would we identify, let's say, someone who's like super into like Trump or something, and you know, they're going to like his rallies, or they're like super enthusiastic about what he's saying, and then this group dynamic comes into place where people are, you know, making accusations about other people that are opposing this kind of political ideology. You know, where do we, there has to be, even like we have to be guided in a more of a religious way before identifying with these more like kind of just these ideologies that are kind of profane in their own way. They're not really guided by anything divine in a sense, even possibly. That's why I always would go back to trying to adopt a religious form of guidance that is way more aligned to something that's wholesome than falling for these kind of cultural phenomenon that come up, like politics, or, you know, a certain, you know, ideology or political movement or something like this. You know, as a Christian, I'd look at those things and be like, they're kind of like false prophets in a way. You know, like identifying with ideologies and stuff. They're not fundamentally the core truth in which we should, that's going to like bring people together. It usually always creates some sort of division. You know, so I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, I wanted to get you to expand on that, because I don't know if you remember, Spencer, but when we had our call and I interviewed you,
yeah,
asked you, what do you want the group to to get out of it, basically, out of this particular thing. And one of the things you said in the end, um, and excuse me if I paraphrase you, but something about an appreciation for religiosity. So I wonder
yeah.
if you could say a little bit about that.
I guess it kind of ties into what I was just saying there as well. I mean, we get caught up a lot in these, like I was saying, like ideological pursuits, culturally, get very easily influenced online by all sorts of stuff like this all the time. And I think it's, if we want more like harmony or balance, or a sense of balance in our own lives, even mentally, in regards to like mental health, it'd be way more beneficial for us to align towards religiosity, because the opposite of that is something that would be more divisive, I think. And when I think of religiosity, I don't really think of like a religion per se. I think of more something that would, like a shared understanding of what a meaningful life is, or what a purposeful life is. Like it goes beyond any of these kind of desires that are more rooted in things like the material world, like, pride, or what Christians might regard as like sin or lustful desires and stuff like this. Something that we can bring people together. And I think like what I was talking about with regards to the shadow and stuff like this, the more we like investigate into what that is for us, with regards to our own insecurities or fears and anxieties, the more we investigate into that, the more we can be honest and vulnerable with ourselves, the more we can align towards a shared understanding of what kind of really matters, basically, which is kind of having faith and having faith in other people, basically, I think.
I saw that Gabe went to say something for the last, so I want to just make sure
But
you have
yeah,
something to share.
I appreciate that. And, it's a really interesting question, Angelo and Spencer. I really appreciate your insight on the, religiosity of it and maybe the lack of. And then I think, Angelo, if I understood it correctly, the question correctly, was kind of like, in the climate we're in, whether that's environmentally or geopolitically, what role does this kind of, at least the way I heard the question was kind of like, where is the role that individuation plays, and then where does the group play? And I think it's really interesting because I feel like right now we're in this climate because there's a lack of individuation. Everybody's really identified with this group, but not really, I think, from a place of it as an individual, but more so, I think either, I think there's a lot there, but I think what I've found is that most people were actually not willing to connect as a group. They were really only willing to just identify as their group. And most of that group was really identified about being opposed to the other group. So it wasn't even like the group is necessarily identified as anything, just really in opposition.
Yeah.
And both of those oppositions would not, there was no dialogue, right? And I think that was like, I had I look at it as more of a blessing to be able to talk to people that I would identify as being in an opposing group. And I found that both sides are often operating out of fear. And so like there's this kind of subconscious individuation where they're like, I need to protect myself, or I'm fearful as an individual. And I'm not actually asking what that fear is about. I'm just targeting this opposing group. And I think that, to kind of bring it all back, I feel like it really is just missing this individuation and the ability to see other people in these opposing groups as individuals. And I found that once people were able to discuss a little bit, everybody was kind of operating from this similar place of fear, from my experience, where everybody was, even on, Trump's biggest fans are oftentimes operating from a place of fear, right? They support these different things or things that they understand because of something that they fear is happening or happened, or et cetera, et cetera. And then same thing for the other side, folks that are maybe really worried about what's happening and really worried about what this represents. And what I found to be the most powerful was actually meeting people that I would otherwise deem to be on this opposing side, and then being able to see each other as individuals. And it was a really healing and kind of, I think, transformational component. And it's something that I think is really not present. Everything is very tribal and
Polarized.
and there's not this individuation and like sense of individual responsibility and agency in thinking about any of these narratives. And it's really like a lot of you versus us, me versus them. And nobody, I think a lot of people, I can't say nobody, but I think a lot of people aren't even asking, how do I feel and why do I feel this way? And I see that on both sides. And so it's really interesting, I think, the role that the individual plays. And maybe that's definitely something we could be watering right now.
You're reminded me of Jung, a few things about Jung. Jung said that, what was it, fanaticism is nothing but overcompensated doubt. And then he also said there's a big difference between individuality and individualism. And then he said that individualism, that that idea of going off on your own path, being unique and quirky, is like a self-worship in a way, whereas the other one, the individuality, is you first inculcate your culture, and then you off the basic principles of your culture, you make it your own. You don't go your own way. You imbibe a full culture first, and I guess that's what's unifying in the first place. You have to be first unified, which is like basically what a monotheistic God does. And it's interesting that when as cultures are evolving, they move from polytheism to monotheism, which is actually what happens on an individual level when a child matures. They stop being ruled by their subcortical drives. They're integrated into a whole when their prefrontal cortex comes online.
I'm just coming back to this word religiosity because I think that's like kind of I don't want to say the elephant in the room, but something important to at least for me to think about. And what I heard Spencer say is that religiosity is not a Catholic thing. It's not an organizational thing. It's something more. And I think that's, to some extent, that's the common aspect of that it's missing. And, you know, I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about what Gabe said when he was talking about, yeah, if you're in the, what Adon was talking about, if you're in individualism, it's difficult for you to think about the other side of that, the collective nature of human beings, right? Or what would you call individual? I forget
Ism. It's like ism, like an
getting out of the individualism and being able to be an individual that connects with the whole.
yeah.
To some extent, in my mind, that requires religiosity. That means that you're part, you know that you're part of something bigger than you, right? And what are you going to do with that? It doesn't matter to me whether it's like whether the response is from a sort of an organizational approach or, well, actually it can't be ultimately from an organizational approach, but that's a whole other thing. But in any event, I'm talking a lot. We have got a couple of minutes left, and Spencer, I'm going to ask you to kind of pull us together and bring us together and say something profound.
Yeah, I was just thinking of you're saying about organizational. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I do think, well, maybe a better way of putting it is kind of aligning more towards the sacred and not the profane, and religiousizing, uh, like what Gabe was saying about, politics and bringing up stuff about like Trump and stuff. I do think like people religiousize profanity, or that within group identities there is this religiousization of things that are kind of profane, like say political leaders or stuff like this, and kind of ideologically kind of worshipping them in some sort of way, whether we realize it or not. And that I do think is a big issue with a few things here and there. But it can also happen probably organizationally. It definitely happens within forms of religion, definitely. Like what Adon was saying with like Protestantism, but also happens within Catholicism as well, different areas. Or is any religion really, where there is this, you could maybe say like heightening of the ego or man above what is regarded as divine or what is God and all this type of thing. So yeah, it's really interesting. But yeah, I hope that what most people took out of this is that we reflect more on how fundamentally there are these lessons that can be found within Christian teachings specifically, because when I was looking into it, a lot of Jungian psychology is not applied through the lens of Christianity or even the teachings of Christ. So that was kind of a big motivation for me when talking about this kind of stuff, because that isn't done very much. It's usually applied in different contexts, usually with like Eastern traditions. So hopefully most people found these concepts also within these other, a Christian tradition as well, but also developed a good understanding of what the hero's journey is and how that works with regards to everything also.